if you're telling a worker what time to come in the morning, okay, you need to come in at 8 o'clock, you take your lunch at noon to 1, and then you go back to work and you work till 5. That is a lot of control. You don't do that with a contractor. With a contractor, you say, hey, I got this project, I need it done by Friday, and here's the parameters. Now, can you do it? What's the price? I say, yep, I'll do it by Friday. I'm going to be working from midnight till 4 in the morning during the week. I only work on Wednesdays. It'll get done, and the price is $1,500. That looks more like an independent contractor.
Good morning, HR. I'm Mike Coffey, president of Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. And this is the podcast where I talk to business leaders about bringing people together to create value for shareholders, customers, and the community. Joining me today to discuss the U.S. Department of Labor's ever-changing definition of independent contractor is David Miklas. David is a labor and employment law attorney representing Florida employers. He's also a prolific author, penning hundreds of employment law articles and co-authoring the premier legal textbook used by lawyers for Florida employment law. David's a frequent conference presenter and university guest lecturer, and he is an educational and thought-provoking LinkedIn follow. Welcome back to Good Morning HR, David.
Great. Thanks for having me. I feel like I should have a jacket or something.
No, when you look like I do, you've got to do something to give yourself some style. So I just try to do this. So, but before we get in,
I'm talking about as a returning guest.
Oh, as a returning guest. Oh, yeah. Oh, just like Saturday Night Live. Yeah. You get the velour. You have to have 3 visits before you get the velour jacket. So we'll get that to you next time. So before we get into the DOL interpretations, why is it that one agency's interpretations of independent contractors even matter so much?
Well, the Department of Labor is charged with enforcing the Fair Labor Standards Act, the FLSA, which requires minimum wage and overtime. But that only applies to employees. So it's a big deal whether or not someone qualifies as an employee or if they're properly classified as a contractor, which is not an employee. Therefore, they would not be covered by, cannot sue under the FLSA. So that is a big difference.
And the term independent contractor doesn't even show up in FLSA, right? So, I mean, they're trying to figure out which workers are employees and which workers aren't, but they don't really address it in FLSA. So the DOL's kind of come up over the years with their own varying interpretations of what makes somebody an independent contractor. And I think when we're talking about independent contractor, we're talking about a person who does work for somebody else, but that's kind of their trade, and it's their business apart. They may offer it to multiple people and things like that. And we kind of all know it's like porn, right? We know it when we see it, but we don't quite really have, putting it in black and white so you can really narrowly define it is kind of what the agency's tried to do over the years, and it really varies from person to person.
Sure, and I mean at the end of the day, there is a test. Sometimes different parts of the test change, but there is a test, and it's up to the business. They have the burden to prove that the worker qualifies as an independent contractor if that's how they're going to choose to classify them. It doesn't matter what the worker wants, doesn't matter what the business wants. Either they meet the test or they don't.
Yeah, and a worker can't just automatically, just easily sign away saying, I waive my FLSA rights.
Correct.
Because employers often I see try to do that, or companies try to say, you signed this agreement that you're an independent contractor, but if they don't meet the test, they're still not an independent contractor, right?
Right, and a lot of workers don't want to be an employee. They want to be in charge of all their own money, and the government doesn't always like that because the reality is that taxes don't get paid if the employer's not taking them out usually.
Yeah, and it all boils down to how much, the reason a lot of this matters is how much money ends up in the government's pockets. But there are provisions for, where you could abuse somebody and say, oh, we're going to call you an independent contractor and we're not going to pay you overtime. Things like that. You could work, you work 100 hours on this job and we're only going to pay you $200, which is well below minimum wage, those kind of things. So,
yeah, and there's a lot of small businesses that the business owner just doesn't understand what the requirements are. And I don't know how many times I've gotten calls where the business tells me, well, for the first 90 days, we give them a 1099. And then if they met, last pass, then we switch them over to W-2, which it's obviously going to be a violation.
Well, and I'm always saying, whenever a client or somebody in the HR world calls me and says, "Hey, can you just talk me through, this independent contractor?" My answer is almost always, if you're not certain at this point, they're not an independent contractor. I mean, it almost never. I would, if I could take those odds to Las Vegas, I'd be rich, because most of the time when somebody starts to go down that path, if you're asking at all, they're not an independent contractor.
I think you're right.
So, we've had that 6-factor test for years that we all kind of used, knew what, roughly what it was going, and maybe the interpretation had changed a little bit. But then under the first Trump administration, right as they were exiting, the rules changed. And then the Biden administration they didn't like those rules, but they didn't exactly go back to the exact emphasis of the 6-factor test, on that all the elements were kind of just loosely evaluated at together, and they shifted some of the focus. And then on May 1st of this year, the Trump administration said, no, we're going back. We're not going to use the Biden eras for enforcement, because they haven't issued a new rule yet. So they're just saying, for enforcement purposes, we're going to go back. The DOL is going to go back to the first Trump administration's rules. So, and then every state, or I assume every state, most states, I guess, have their own definitions of what an independent contractor is under their state labor law. So if I'm an employer, what regulations do I follow?
And that's a good question. And I don't think we're quite there yet. I think the Department of Labor has telegraphed that they're probably going to go back to Trump 1.0, but we're not quite there yet. And in fact, at the beginning of May, what they issued actually was a fact sheet, which still lays out the 6-factor economic realities test. And both you and I said 6-factor, but technically it could be even more than 6 factors. It says that additional factors may be considered as well if they're relevant. Out of those listed identified 6 factors, no single factor determines the worker status. So it's not like, okay, well, if we blew one of these, we're done. That's not how it works. It really is a balancing test. And technically, just so we're very clear, even under Trump 1.0, when they did the different test, it was basically, it changed it from 6 factors. They combined 2 factors into one. They really had a 5-factor test, but they put a lot of emphasis on 2 specific factors, which are still in the economic realities test. The 2 factors that under Trump 1.0 that they focused on was the nature and degree of control. So control has always been there, and it probably always will be there. And then also the opportunity for profit and loss. And that is still one of those 6 factors in the economic realities test. Now, we're not quite there yet. We're still using the economic realities test, but probably we're going to have the other one, brought back. But the reality is, it's not like an easy test. It still is a burden for the business, and plenty of businesses would never have met the Trump 1.0 test.
When you just review them, I don't see the giant differences over the years.
I agree, Mike. I agree. Yeah. A lot of people think, oh, well, Trump is pro-business and everything's, well, I mean, just look who got appointed in Trump 2.0 in the Department of Labor. It's not necessarily as clean as everyone might assume it is. I still think, well, if you want to go through the factors, I think, a lot of people still need to focus on the opportunity for profit and loss. And what this means is that, is the worker themselves negotiating their pay? Are they deciding, okay, if I do this project, I need $1,500 to do the project? And basically they build in their gas and tools and all that kind of stuff into whatever they're quoting. Does the worker themselves decide to accept or decline work? Can they turn down projects that the business wants to give them and have no repercussions? Can they hire their own workers, contractors or employees for themselves to answer their phones or do whatever they want to do? Do they purchase their own materials and equipment? Do they have their own website, have their own business cards, basically do their own marketing to try and get other business? One of the key factors is they should be able to have multiple clients, not just one. Now, if the worker has to basically get approval from the business, that really is a thing that indicates that they're really an employee, at least for this one factor. So the opportunity for profit and loss is one of the key factors. And then I think that the control is absolutely another of the key factors. And when I say the control, that's the nature and degree of control. And that's always been one. It is with the IRS test too. What this means is that whether the potential employer, whether the business controls, or the worker controls hiring, firing, scheduling, prices, pay rates. Is there any supervision of the work? Ideally, you don't supervise an independent contractor, very, very minimally. And this is a big one under Trump 1.0. At the very end, there was a Department of Labor opinion letter that came out that focused on technology like Uber and Lyft and stuff. And basically, what they said was like, if you use technological means to supervise your workers, that can show control. So, and just so we're clear, just recently, the Department of Labor essentially resurrected the opinion letter I'm talking about. So on May 2nd, 2025, the Department of Labor resurrected an April 2019 opinion letter that was withdrawn in 2021. And that opinion letter addressed classification in the context of the virtual marketplace. And like under control in that opinion letter, they said, hey, you know what? This is something that requires a worker to work exclusively for the business. If you do that, they're probably not a contractor. If they have to disavow working or interacting with competitors during the relationship or even after, that's probably not a contractor. So if they're signing a non-compete, they're probably not going to meet the test.
And then, so those are the two big ones under Trump. And I mean, for me, those are the two that seem most obvious. I mean, if I'm doing this and I've got control over profit or loss, and how much money ends up in my pocket, not profit or loss for the company that I'm performing this business for, but how much shows up in my pocket at the end of it. That seems like, a lot more entrepreneurial, a lot more, I am setting my own, prices, and the employer can walk if they don't want to do it. And how much my materials cost, all that.
And sometimes if you think about, okay, if you have a fleet of drivers to make deliveries, this would be, say you have a list of 30 drivers. Say, hey, Bob, we have this delivery in Miami today. And like, oh, forget that. I don't want to go to Miami. Traffic's too crazy. I'm not taking it. And it's like, okay, no problem. I go to the next person on the list. And then eventually you get someone on the list. That does look like an independent contractor. But if you punish Bob for not taking that assignment, if you never call him again, or you don't give him any more work, that probably is something that looks more like an employee, where you're requiring them to take everything you give them. Now, if they have a lot of control and say, no, I'm not taking that, or no, that part of town, I'm stalled in traffic all the time. It takes me 2 hours to make 2 deliveries, whereas I can go in this other part of town and make 15 deliveries. That's a big decision that person is making themselves, and they're using their own business mind. And that looks a lot more entrepreneurial if they're picking and choosing which projects to take. That's what an independent contractor really does.
And that's what rideshare drivers do, right? Uber, and I mean,
Yep.
they pay attention to what part of town they're parked in to pick up rides and when they're going to do them. They decide, they get opportunities to decline rides and do all of that. So, I think we can see that. And then again, how much control? I mean, do you have a boss, or is this just a customer? If I call a plumber, I don't ask my plumber if he's got does he have a corporate entity, and does he, and is he really set up as an independent? I just assume he is. And I'm not sitting there overlooking as, hey, turn it this way, or don't do that. Or, I'm not trying to tell him how to, God forbid that I try to tell him how to do plumbing or electricity. We'd be electrocuted and flooded. So,
Yeah. And so a lot of businesses, they screw up even the most basic part of this. Like, for instance, if you're telling a worker what time to come in the morning, okay, you need to come in at 8 o'clock. You take your lunch at noon to 1, and then you go back to work and you work till 5. That is a lot of control. You don't do that with a contractor. With a contractor, you say, hey, I got this project. I need it done by Friday, and here's the parameters. Now, can you do it? What's the price? I say, yep, I'll do it by Friday. I'm going to be working from midnight till 4 in the morning during the week. I only work on Wednesdays. It'll get done, and the price is $1,500. That looks more like an independent contractor, where they are picking and frankly, like a lot of IT people are contractors. They sit at home. They never even come in the workplace. You're never looking over their shoulder. You're never giving them any equipment. They're remoting in and doing their work sometimes.
And they're doing it for other people and
Absolutely.
things like that. So just because they're not remote, I mean, 5 years ago, pre-COVID, maybe if they were working remote, it was highly likely that that was good evidence. Probably less so now because there's so many of us are remote. So those are the two big ones under the Trump standard, but there's still other ones. So let's just go through some of those other standards.
Sure.
Which
So
one?
like
Which one do you think you see most often be an issue now?
there are definitely some issues. I don't see it so much with. Yeah, I'll go through in the order that I think is
Okay.
most important. Um, Probably investments that the worker makes, and these things are they have to be capital investments or entrepreneurial in nature. So, for instance, if you have a huge truck and it's holding a specialized piece of equipment like some kind of CAT scan or some kind of machine like that the truck was designed and built for, you really can't use that truck for anything else. You can't haul around your family or anything like that. That is an investment that you made for your business that allows you to work independently for a bunch of other people too. And we see this sometimes. Dentist offices, they don't have a $15,000 whatever kind of scanner it is, and they'll bring in some contractor and they'll literally park their big fancy truck in the parking lot, and then they only come maybe on Mondays. And then anytime that dentist office needs their patients to be seen, they schedule it all on Mondays, and their patient literally goes in the parking lot and boards this truck for 2 minutes to get their scan done. Like so that
And
would be the investment. We're not talking about very minor things, buying paper, whatever, but it could be things like buying specialized software, maybe renting your own office, bringing your own computers and tablets and all that kind of stuff. It's not dollar for dollar who's paying more, but the more specialized things that have to be used, ideally the worker will have made the investment in that.
for if it's an independent contractor,
I'm sorry.
and
Yes.
yeah, and then on the flip side, I see like roofing companies seem to be notorious for it. They have trucks out there with their logos on the side of the trucks, and they've got uh, people going out and either maybe selling roofs in their trucks, running around doing that, and uh, maybe they're giving them hit this neighborhood, do this, but they're using their trucks, or the crews are using their trucks, but they want to call all the crew independent contractors. And I think if they're out there in uniforms, especially, but roofers, you're lucky if they're wearing a shirt. But if they're looking like they work for the company, they're presenting themselves with assets of the company and the vehicles and things like that. Does that suggest that they're going to be more likely to be employees of the
Yeah,
company than?
and that's a very good question that a lot of business owners don't make the connection. When I am hired to put together an independent contractor agreement, first of all, probably about 75% of the thing I charge is the analysis. And then if I don't think that they actually meet the test, I won't even draft the contract. But let's assume, for sake of argument, that either there's enough there, or else we can, enough that we can make a couple modifications that I'm comfortable with that. One of the things I tell my clients is, listen, I would strongly recommend, if they're wearing any kind of clothing at all that has your company name on it, that you literally stitch on there contractor for. And we see this with like Comcast cable. They'll say contractor for Comcast on the side of the truck. The truck may be owned by the worker, and they have a magnet, and on the side of that it says official contractor for AT&T. So we do see this when it's done the right way. But yeah, if the business owns a fleet of trucks and has their company name printed on the side of it, and someone's driving it, yeah, that sure looks a lot more like an employee than a contractor. Whereas if the contractor has all their own stuff, and maybe you just want them a little bit to look like, so if you're knocking on doors, no one's going to answer the door if they don't think that it could be legit. So if you want them wearing your roofing company shirt, I would definitely say contractor for, or even a hat. All kinds of apparel, you can sell it, you can buy it, and at the very least on Amazon for $10, you can get a name tag that says contractor for whatever your
Right.
company is.
So we've got investments by both parties to help weigh that seesaw one way or the other. What else? What are the next ones?
There's the permanence of the relationship. That means, is this someone who's working sporadically or on a project by project basis with a fixed end date, or is this something which would be good, that would indicate independent contractor agreement or arrangement, or is this something where the worker is only, it looks like they're just working there forever, especially if they're working right alongside someone doing the exact same thing, and like one programmer is an employee and the next programmer doing the exact same thing is a contractor, yeah, that probably is not going to be legitimate. Ideally, someone that works for a discrete period of time, and it could be a longer period of time, like so let's say 3 months. So let's say you have a hurricane come through Texas and knocks down a bunch of trees and cause a lot of damage, and you need to bring in some contractors. Let's just say you have, I don't know, 1,000 acres, and you're out there with chainsaws, a whole crew of people with chainsaws chopping up the trees and stuff. That may take a long time, and it could be months at a time, but it's for a discrete project. And they may have bid for that project or offered to do, hey, we'll clean up your farm for $15,000. And it doesn't matter if they're working, 50-hour weeks or 2-hour weeks. That doesn't matter. If they're legitimately going to be a contractor and it's a discrete project, that can be appropriate. So the permanence is one factor. So if someone's been working for you for 5 years, pretty much regularly, that looks a lot more like employee, at least for that factor.
And let's take a quick break. Good Morning HR is brought to you by Imperative, bulletproof background checks with fast and friendly service. By bulletproof, we mean that our clients can take the information we provide to the bank. We don't cut corners to make research faster or cheaper. We use technology to augment our well-trained analysts, never to replace their experience or judgment. And we offer the most thorough and compliant background investigations available. If you're not sure that that's what you're getting today, we'd love to talk to you. You can learn more at imperativeinfo.com. If you're an HRCI or SHRM certified professional, this episode of Good Morning HR has been pre-approved for 1/2 hour of recertification credit. To obtain the recertification information, visit goodmorninghr.com and click on Research Credits. Then select episode 208 and enter the keyword Contractor. That's CONTRACTOR. And if you're looking for even more recertification credit, check out the webinars page at imperativeinfo.com. And now back to my conversation with David Miklas. But that doesn't mean that if I'm going to bring in just an individual for office admin clerical just to cover some work while somebody else is busy or out on vacation or whatever, and they work 40 hours a week on my schedule for a month, that's not very permanent. They're temps. But with that they're more likely to be a regular employee, though, right? Because
and that's why you have to look at all of the factors. Right. Even if we're going back to the 2-factor test, if it's not crystal clear with the 2 heavily weighted factors, then you still need to look at all the other ones. And this is where it kind of makes sense, because you can't structure it. There's no question this person absolutely meets this 1-factor test, but then blows all the other factors. That's not going to be fair either. So, ideally, if you're trying to make sure that your worker is legitimately going to be classified as an independent contractor, and the way I describe it is, you think of it like you have 2 buckets, like a gallon bucket, and you have water, and you're dropping a drop of water, and it has to go in one of the 2 buckets. And you're never going to have all that water go into the one bucket that says independent contractor on the outside. Some of it's going to drip into the employee bucket. At the end of the day, which bucket has more water in it? That's how I try and describe it to my clients. We want to set it up so that most of this stuff looks like it falls underneath the independent contractor, because you're never going to get everything to perfectly align. But permanence is one factor. But let's say you have someone cutting your grass for your business, Mike, and Juan's landscaping. You may love Juan. He does a great job, and you've had him for 8 years. That doesn't mean that he's not going to be a legitimate independent contractor. If everything else is met, just because it's a long-term relationship, that doesn't kill it. Now, that one factor may look a little bit more like an employee, but when you look at all the other factors, that overweighs it and overpowers it. I mean, if Juan's bringing all his own equipment, you're not out there telling him when to weed eat and how to do it. All those other factors come into play.
And he probably does it for a lot of other people. And, yes. We're not his, if he was working, on my commercial property 5 days a week and all of that, it would be a different story, even though that's not the business.
Yeah, he probably has 200 other customers. He probably has a website. He probably has business cards. He probably has a side of his truck that says Juan's Lawn Services. It doesn't say your company, things like that.
So what's the next factor then?
The next factor will be the skill and initiative. This depends on whether the worker, to do their job, it requires some specialized skill. Like, do they have to go out and get some specialized license? Or a welder is a good example. So that's a specialized skill, and the key is, where do they get that skill? If the business trained them on how to do it, that looks like an employee. If they got that skill on their own, then that looks more like an independent contractor. So if you have a highly skilled welder, but they don't have to determine anything for the job, if they're just all day long, they weld for your company, and you tell them, okay, Monday you're welding boat trailers, and this is how you do it. That looks like an employee. Whereas if they have a specialized skill of welding, and they say, hey, you know what? I got my company, I have my website, and I'm working for 10 different companies this month, and I'm doing whatever projects they have. I'm really good at welding, with this, arc weld, certain kind of welding equipment, and they may do different things for different companies, and they get to pick and choose what they have, and they get a price whatever they want. They're not just given work and have to do it. So the skill and initiative is a big factor, and sometimes we'll see this with someone that comes in with a very specialized skill, like maybe a behavior therapist or something like that, RBT. And we have this a lot of times in the mental health area in a company. Sometimes they're employees, and sometimes they can be independent contractors. It really depends on what the arrangement is. But the skill is a big factor. And generally, your contractors have some specialized skill that your average employees can't. Otherwise, you'd be just training your employees typically.
Have we covered them all? Let's see.
There's one easy. Well, I don't know how easy it is, but integral. To me, it's the easiest one. I mean, it's whether the work is critical or necessary or central to the principal business. So most law firms, they do legal work by lawyers. I would venture to say that in general, a lawyer is pretty integral to a law firm. An accountant, a CPA, is pretty integral to an accounting firm. However, if my law firm or an accounting firm occasionally has a problem with its computers, we have to, pay some IT person to fix them. That IT person probably is not going to be an employee. Maybe I only call them once a month, once every quarter, once every 6 months when there's a problem or when I want to upgrade some software. Similar, the example in the regs involved a pickle farmer or tomato farmer. And they said, okay, someone who picks tomatoes on the tomato farm, that's pretty integral. However, that tomato farm once a year, or has to file their taxes. The accountant that does their taxes once a year is not integral to the tomato picking business. So that to me, that's a pretty easy one.
And like you said, no one of these is
controlling,
is right? So they're all over the place. So where do you see? At least in your practice in Florida, where do you see the most confusion with them? What kinds of roles or are employers, where do you see them screwing it up the most?
It really spans every industry. Maybe not fast food, but a lot of business owners just seem to think, I don't want to pay overtime. As long as I reach an agreement with this person, and they're a contractor, great. I don't have to pay overtime. I don't have to pay taxes. I can even pay them more because I'm not paying tax. I'm not paying Social Security or FICA. And, they just think, as a business person, in your business mind, that makes sense. Hey, I'm putting more money in this guy's pocket or this woman's pocket. They're probably happy. Well, that doesn't matter. You still have to meet the test. And there's different tests. Like you said, every state, certain states have different tests. But the IRS has its own test. And frankly, it's easier than the Department of Labor test. So even if a business owner goes to their accountant and says, hey, I want to work with this person. I think I want to put them on as an independent contractor. What do you say, Mr. Accountant? And the accountant says, yeah, it looks good to me. That meets our IRS test. It may not meet the Department of Labor test. And that's a mistake I see. Even if someone thinks that they got blessing from their professional, provider, their accountant, it may absolutely be the wrong answer when it comes to, the Department of Labor. And at the end of the day, if you've employed or if you've misclassified a worker as an independent contractor, let's say 3 years, and you have maybe 10 of them, if the Department of Labor comes in for any reason, let's say one employee says that they work through lunch and they get paid. Once the Department of Labor's foot is in the door, they ask for a bunch of documents, and one of their questions at the beginning is, first of all, do you have any minors working for you? But one of the other key things they always ask for is, do you have any contractors? And then they say, give me all your independent contractor agreements. Let me see how you paid them. And then you better have a stack of invoices from those contractors. You better not have them commingled and pay them on the same day you pay all your employees. They better not be on that same spreadsheet where your employee list is. That's a very common mistake I see, where people just think that they can reach an agreement between a business and a worker, that they're going to be a contractor, and poof, they're magically a contractor. It's just a lot of ignorance, frankly. It's not always where a business is trying to screw the worker or trying to take advantage of them. They just frankly are ignorant of the requirements. Now, sometimes they are trying to screw them.
Right. Yeah, I was about to say. Yeah,
Okay.
if you're asking yourself, how can I not pay this person overtime, or how do I avoid fooling with withholding tax? How do I avoid something? Then there's a good chance that you already know in your heart of hearts that this person's probably a legit employee. But but there are industry practices where industries that use a lot of contractors, and some of those contractors are really bona fide companies with multiple employees and supervisors and all that. And then they've got John over here, who's just a plumber we use from time to time, or a plumber we use every day on site. We're going to say we're just subbing this work. He's a sub. We're sending the work to him, but he's always working for us. Then you start to wonder, okay, how closely do you supervise John?
That word, that's really important. If supervision, if that's happening, it's probably not going to be a contractor, because, and I've seen it where they've had someone classified as an independent contractor, and that person is supervising an employee. That should never happen. Your outside contractor can't supervise your employees. And similarly, even if you have someone that you've classified as a contractor, they really should not be subject to any kind of supervision, or extremely minimal supervision, just making sure they're not completely screwing up the project. If, let's say, you're building a house and you have someone coming in and doing cabinets, you need to make sure that they're not banging the cabinets into the wall. The person on the job can occasionally make sure there's not big holes in the wall, but they should not be looking over their shoulder, literally supervising. I mean, I've seen it sometimes where a lawn service, try to classify people as independent contractors, or a security company try to say they're security workers or independent contractors. It could be, depending on the situation. But if someone's just driving by, making sure, yep, someone's guarding that front door, and they just keep on driving by past that, that could be fine. That's extremely minimal supervision. But if they're in there, like someone at a hotel or something in hospitality, where they're actually entering the rooms, making sure that they're doing the bed, making the beds the right way, and cleaning the toilets and all that stuff, that's a straight up employee, most likely, with the supervisor that's also an employee.
And with all these factors, and what's the so what with an employer? How much trouble can I get in? I mean,
A
it's
lot.
primarily it's not. Is it the misclassification, or is it the penalties for all the things that you should have done if they were an employee that you didn't do with them as an independent contractor?
And that's a great question. First of all, there's risks not just with the Department of Labor. There can be National Labor Relations Act risks, because contractors are not employees. So if they're not an employee, then they're not going to be covered by the NLRA. So they don't get any of those rights under the NLRA. Similarly, they don't get protections under the FLSA or Title VII or any of the other anti-discrimination. None of that stuff would apply to a contractor to give them protection. So there's they would miss out on all that. But the biggest risk really comes if the worker's working a ton of hours and they're misclassified. Then more than likely, the business is going to be on the hook for a lot of money for unpaid overtime. Now, there's always going to be the taxes that weren't paid properly, and there's fines and penalties associated with that. And frankly, I'm not a tax attorney. You'd have to deal with your accountant with that. And there's ways that you can get with the government. If you don't get caught and you figure out yourself, oh my gosh, we've misclassified this, there's a program with the government where you can say, hey, listen, we want to do the right thing. We realize we didn't have these people classified. They have a program where you can pay, I don't know what it is, but it's like 10 cents on the dollar to get caught up and pay them right from the government, from the IRS perspective. The biggest liability I see with the Department of Labor is unpaid overtime, because, you don't have to pay overtime if they're not an employee.
And it's treble damages, right?
Double, too.
A double. Oh, it's double damage. And plus, a double damages, but you also have to pay them the original. So it's Is that
Well,
right?
no, for the
It's what
Department
the
of
overtime
Labor,
that yes, the
it's
overtime they
unpaid
were owed.
wages. Yeah,
You're
whatever the
right.
unpaid wages were. Typically,
Plus
I state
damage.
with unpaid overtime. But let's just
Uh-huh.
say it's $10,000 of unpaid wages. And they can go back
Mm-hmm.
2 years, typically 2 years, for anyone that worked for you. Could be a former worker. So let's say they go back and it's $10,000 of unpaid wages. Well, typically they will assess what's called liquidated damages, and that doubles it. So if you have liability for one worker for 10 grand, now all of a sudden you have to pay 20 grand to resolve that one case. And that's assuming that the government came in. That's assuming the Department of Labor Wage and Hour Division is the one that investigated and discovered this. If a lawyer came in and figured this out and is suing you, then you're going to have to pay the unpaid wages, you're going to have to pay the liquidated damages, and you're going to have to pay a reasonable attorney fee for your own lawyer and for the worker's lawyer. And that's where this thing really balloons. And that's why at the very beginning, if you ever get a letter from the Department of Labor investigating this, or even a letter threatening, like we call these demand letters, from a lawyer saying, hey, I think you misclassified this worker, and I think you need to pay $50,000 or else we're going to sue you. Immediately, you need to bring in your employment lawyer, because they need to assess, okay, first of all, did we misclassify them? And if the answer is yes, then it doesn't really matter. There's no but. It's yes and. So yes, we misclassified them, and this is how we're going to fix it. And you need to fix it immediately, because the only thing that happens over the passage of time is the attorney's fees go up. So if you have that $10,000 liability, you're going to always have it. You either have it or you don't. And maybe it's $2. That's the problem. If you only have, $1,000 of liability, and if the lawyer has to litigate the case to a jury trial, that could be $100,000 in attorney's fees, and they're going to get their attorney's fees if they're reasonable to recover that $1,000 for their worker. So that's why it's really important to analyze it with the lawyer immediately. Okay, do we have exposure? If so, most of these cases settle, and they settle at the beginning just because that's usually the cheapest time to settle it, because the attorney's fees on both sides will skyrocket.
Well, that's all the time we have. So the bottom line here, just classify them right. If you've got doubts, err on the side of making them an employee or talk to your lawyers. And we didn't really get into it, but also make sure you've got a written agreement with that independent contractor, uh, laying out the relationship and being compliant still with those 6 factors, right?
Yes, the contract itself is not going to be determinative, but if you're legitimately having a lawyer draft that contract, then they should be going through the analysis, or else most ethical lawyers would not agree to draft the contract anyway.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for joining me, David. I appreciate
you.
it. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please write us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening. And then share this episode on your favorite social media network. It's really how people find us, and I'm so appreciative when I see somebody reshare one of our posts. And we'd love to hear your thoughts at goodmorninghr.com. The podcast is produced by Marianne Hernandez and Paco Corrales of Imperative's marketing team, and the Good Morning HR theme music was created by Steve Pegler at HR Strategies of Texas. And I'm Mike Coffey. As always, don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you personally or professionally. I'll see you next week, and until then, be well, do good, and keep your chin up.